I could talk about my arm forever because my arm is, and I've used this phrase before, is like the mothership of all the plays that I've done since, all the work that I've done since, to some degree refer back to that text. But that text was not written academically, it was not written consciously. That text was me just starting to tell the story of a boy who puts his arm above his head. And in the process of trying to articulate that narrative, generate that narrative, all the frustrations and the complexities and the difficulties and the depressions that I had around my position as an actor in theatre, they just fell into it. They fell into it. They fell into it less in the narrative, but they fell into it around the form. So I think very early on in the process of writing that piece, I knew that I wouldn't in the telling of the story, ever raise my arm above my head. I knew very early on it would be an autobiographical piece, even though it would not be an autobiographical piece because I've never lived with one arm above my head. But I knew that I would play in the language of autobiography. I think this is 2002. Around that time, there were people making work around their lives. I mean, we can go back to Spalding Gray, or, you know, there are other people, a guy called Guy Dartnell, beautiful theatre maker called Guy Dartnell, had made a play about his virginity. And I didn't think I had a story about myself. I didn't think I had a story about myself, and I perhaps had some questions around making work about oneself. Yeah, thinking about it now, going back to those rebirthers on that residential Grotowski course, don't think I had an investment in my own story, really. So I wanted to make a fictional story, but I wanted to play in the tropes and the vocabulary around autobiography and biography. And then I also knew that formally I would refute at every step of the way in the telling of that story the truth of that story. So I think by the second weekend of writing, not only did I know I wouldn't put my arm above my head, but I also would substitute characters with objects. So that's a big theme. And it's a theme that I developed slightly in my teaching, because towards the end of my acting career I was doing more teaching, where I would often in class remove the actors out of a scene and replace them with inanimate objects. So a teacup, or I can see a teacup, I can see a coat, or I can see a bottle of water, or a packet of biscuits, or a kettle, or a fire extinguisher. I remember doing an Uncle Vanya, scene from Uncle Vanya, with a fire extinguisher and a bottle of water as Vanya and Sonia. Actors out of the scene but delivering text. The objects not moving like puppets, but just, I think, thinking about positional things. So I just lifted that process in a way and put it into my arm. But all the time now, and I can talk about it now, I can talk about it for days now. I couldn't talk about it intelligently then, maybe. But that was me struggling with the processes that I had been placed in as an actor and wanting to really challenge them, I think. And those processes were all around realism, psychology, naturalism maybe, trying to convince other people that I was not who I am, but I was someone else. And also being in rehearsals as an actor, and really there not being much attention paid to the audience. There being a lot of attention paid to an actor's process, but less about an audience process. So I was thinking in my teaching about the audience process, and that was then, and I'm still thinking about the audience process now. I think the audience process for me is as interesting, if not more interesting, than the actor's process. And I make my work in reflection of an audience process, rather than without consideration of that. So my arm has these key moments. One is, I don't raise my arm. Two is objects selected at random, entirely at random by me, the performer, are nominated, is the word that I would use, are nominated as the characters in the story. They are named as my mother, as my father, as my brother. Again, I don't activate them like puppetry. They are just presented. And I love the way an audience responds to that offer by imbuing those objects with significance without me having to do anything. That's a lesson, I think, for all theatre makers, is that the audience want to imbue things with significance. That's their role, that's their task. They want to deconstruct, or they want to decode symbols. They want to do that. They want to do that. Or they want to resolve contradictions. They want to do that. So there is a moment in my arm where I talk about having this finger removed, amputated, because it was dead, and my finger is still here. It might be the first moment in the play where you might realize it's not my story. It's not my story. I talk about having a scar on my back where I tried to kill myself, and I show the audience my back, and I don't have a scar on my back, but I know that everyone in the audience leans forward and kind of generates a scar on my back, even though throughout the whole process of that play, I am refuting everything. This packet of cigarettes is my dad. This finger still exists. I don't have my arm above my head.